Today, Chuck and Brock talk about mental representation, Chapter 25, by Professor Panaccio, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
It's exciting to me, Chuck, about this chapter, because this is really maybe one of the most important aspects, not only of medieval philosophy itself, but of philosophy in general. And so this chapter is on mental representation. And the idea here is that as a prelude or precondition for human knowledge, philosophers want to talk about what might be happening inside of the human mind and brain in order for knowledge to even be acquired. And this is where we have the classic distinction. Of course, it goes back even to some of the discussions in antiquity, but the author here talks about how medieval philosophers really bifurcate and talk about and distinguish two major sort of qualities. First is that which is in the mind, in anima, and then that which is outside of the mind, extra animum. And so this idea, growing up, Chuck, I had a lot of chances to hear a Kantian modern narrative about how before Kant, before Hegel, before the Enlightenment, thinkers didn't really distinguish too much between objective and subjective. And in particular, they tended to minimize the subjective and its role in knowledge acquisition. And I always thought that was an interesting statement to me because it really seemed to paint earlier thinkers as really, I'm searching for a better word than stupid. It really seemed to be extremely reductionistic and oversimplistic to say that prior to Kant, prior to Rousseau, prior to even going back Locke and some of the earlier thinkers, that the pre-modern world was not sensitive to the fact that the human animal has a perspective, and that knowledge is to some degree conditioned by that perspective. And the narrative that I heard went that Kant reinvented philosophy, finally put it back on a healthy track as opposed to the unhealthy track it was on before, where it was saddled with the unsophisticated dogmas of faith and religion, gumming up the works, as it were. And imagine my surprise here, and I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek, but to hear the author here talks about how medieval philosophers, this is absolutely nothing new to them, and that they were thinking about and talking about. Of course, they were not Kantian. They were not discussing things in the Kantian way, but that would be anachronistic. But they were still deeply engaged with that. And they had something to say, even if not modern, but they still had a lot of investigation to do and a lot of different things to throw out, some of which, of course, we reject today. Some models and some ideas of the foundations of knowledge and how knowledge might be represented in the human animal are clearly not tenable in the light of further data, in the light of scientific investigation. But I don't think that the modernists own that. And I don't think this narrative of you have faith and we have science, it is a tenable one. The truth is much more subtle and sophisticated than that. How about you? How did the beginning of the chapter strike you?
Yeah, it was really interesting to me. As you point out, there does seem to be somewhat of a narrative that philosophy was reinvented by Kant and that there's so much new that he invented. And yet it does seem that while there is a subtle difference between the idea of in anima and extra animum versus subjective and objective thinking, there's still, it's not as if the medievals didn't have any clue to some of these terms. And so that's right. And then the other thing I was just thinking about, it strikes me that even though, again, modern philosophers seem to talk about some of these issues in coming at them from maybe somewhat different angles, perhaps, but it does seem yet that some of the same sort of issues come up and discussions of how is it that we get from seeing an object and perceiving it and then remembering it and then intellectually using that and recalling it for our intellectual purposes. How that process all works is still something that is often discussed quite a bit. And there are a lot of different thinkers who get at those kind of concepts. And it does seem like that there's maybe a sense in which we think more linguistically today. I'm thinking about linguistics as a way of getting at some of those philosophical questions. But I don't necessarily see that we're not any closer to answers either. And there does seem to be, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a psychologist, just trying to pay little bit of attention to what gets talked about in those worlds, there still doesn't seem to be a real complete sense of how that all works. And we have certain ideas about symbols and meaning, how we attach meaning to symbols and those kinds of things, but yet there still isn't a 100% accepted theory as to how that all works in the brain and what is it that's exactly happening in the brain. And that may be important because I know that there is discussion about what happens as we get to the point where we may be able to have computers with much more ability to think in ways that replicate human ways of thinking. At what point does there become a change? Do computers become human-like? And I think we see those who say there might come a point at which that may happen, and there may come a point at which we may have to think about, do computers have certain types of rights the way that humans do? And then you have others who say that could never happen. There is just something completely different about the human as opposed to a computer that couldn't happen. And so then even thinking about how that process works of something happening in the world, and then it being perceived, and then it being remembered, and then it being processed intellectually. All of those things are really same kind of ideas that we're thinking about in this modern world. Again, even though they're in somewhat angles. Just as you pointed out, the medievals weren't dumb. They had important things that they were thinking about and talking about, and maybe they didn't have quite the same ways of talking about it that we do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't an important discussion happening.
Good points. The stakes are high here. The ultimate stake, and I'm quoting from page 346, the ultimate stake here is the capacity, the human capacity for reaching, now here's the scary word, Chuck, for reaching truth. There, we said it. There's the 800-pound elephant in the room. Can the human even reach truth? Is that a meaningful question? All of my Kantian and Hegelian and modern phenomenological friends went so overboard with their modern anti-supernaturalistic enterprise that it's quite clear that on a naive basis, the unaided human animal may in fact not have any capacity for reaching something called truth. And yet, having concluded such a thing, the relativists live in a world where they swim around like ducks in a pond, making deposits into their bank accounts, fully expecting one day they will go to said bank and be able to draw upon those deposits the exact amount that they put in. So there's a disconnect here. I can't tell you how many discussions I've been in where someone speaking from a modern perspective just cavalierly rejects the idea that humans can reach truth and then wants to live in a world where they certainly believe that there are values that they would hold to, both good and evil, in what seem to me to be objective ways. And for example, you can think of a classic discussion point where someone talks about suffering and evil in the world. And for philosophers, for example, like Schopenhauer, there was a reality to pain. There was something real about suffering that is unignorable. And so you and I, Chuck, can maybe talk each other in circles in the halls of academia, speaking philosophically. But in the ER, in the hospital, in the situation where your body is broken and going through trauma and trying to respond and trying to heal, it's very hard to maintain that the human animal is unable to actually reach truth in some sense. So all of this to say, we need something more subtle and more sophisticated here than just a pure objectivism, and something more subtle and more sophisticated here than simply a pure relativism. So truth and falsity, citing Aristotle, are thought of as features of propositions. And so you have these propositional statements, or what we today might call Boolean statements that correspond to reality, presumably, and cohere to reality. That is to say, are consistent in some logical sense. So we're not violating the law of contradiction, for example. And so if you do not start off by presupposing an objectivism, then it's very difficult to see how anything can come out of this in a productive way. But yet, there is the perspective. There is the subjective aspect of reality that to some degree conditions our proposition. Boy, Chuck, that was as clear as mud. Anybody who wanted a nice, easy, clean, neat picture for the structure of reality is not going to find that statement from me making things easy and simple. But that's a complexity. That's an issue about reality that the medievals had to deal with. Even going back into Aristotle and the folks from antiquity, this was understood. And so we have to deal with fundamental questions. Are we adequate to reach truth? If so, under what conditions? On what foundations? On what basis can we reach truth? Is knowledge simply propositional? This is a non-trivial question. Some people, including in the Reformed tradition, and here I think, for example, in the last generation, about Gordon H. Clark, talked about knowledge as a feature of propositional truth, and perhaps emphasizing propositional truth and minimizing perhaps any other forms of knowledge about reality. This is tricky. And then, of course, you have opponents on the other side who wish to pull away from the propositional foundation of reality and just make it about impressions, sensations, mind images. And so we're really in a pickle here, Chuck. Where are we going to go? We've got a lot of wiggle room in the continuum of ideas about how the human animal can even know something. What's the role of science here is also a big question. And people who think they've got a simple and easy answer almost certainly have not thought very hard about the issues. I'm really opening the floodgates here. This is a wide chapter in principle in terms of the coverage that it comes to, and yet it's simple. How are intellectual representations present in the mind? What are the building blocks for human knowledge? And it's good to even start with this grammar, even if we agree that we're not necessarily going to start on the same path. I think there's a lot of room for constructive dialogue here, even with folks outside of my understanding of the world. How does that fit with what you've had when you're talking with people, and how you'd like to bootstrap those kinds of discussions?
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in thinking about truth and propositional truth and how do we get there and what can we rely on, whether it's our physical observations, whether it's rational thinking through, all those kinds of things. And what does science tell us about the way the brain works and perceives reality and perceives truth? And as we've talked about over the last couple of years, really, there is a sense in which the loss of a belief in the transcendent, the loss of the belief in a God who is transcendent, has narrowed in many ways the choices that we have thinking about those, has perhaps even eliminated some ways of thinking about things. And as a result, we may be really missing out. And you and I have talked about and how we as Christians, we are fortunate in some ways that we also can look at scripture, we can also look at theology as informing us, in helping us to form our philosophies in the way we think about those things. And one of the things that made me think through that process and think through, once again, how might a Christian do philosophy differently than a non-Christian? And what are some of the sources that we may have for trying to determine truth, actually just came out of sort of an appreciation in this chapter that I thought the author, Claude Panaccio, a couple of times throughout the chapter seemed to at least have a recognition. Whether or not he's a believer, I have no idea. I didn't look anything up about him. All I know is he's, I think, at the University of Montreal or something like that. No idea of where he comes down on these things. But a couple of times it did seem to me that he at least had an appreciation for, and I suppose as a medieval scholar you should, but an appreciation for the fact that many of the medieval thinkers were religious thinkers, and that theological concerns had an impact on and impacted their way of thinking about these things. I thought the comment that you pointed to early about the centrality of truth, and that what's the ultimate stake here is the human capacity for reaching truth. Later on page 351, he talks a little bit about Thomas Aquinas and how some of Aquinas's thinking about these special objects of thought, the possible intellect and these concepts that Aquinas talked about. How for Aquinas, there was this additional impact that there was some theological appeal, some of these ideas, because Aquinas was able to connect some of these ideas to things that he read in Augustine, and how, I think the quote here on 351 is, Aquinas sees this internal engendering of concepts by the human mind, by which he's talking about this multiple step process that we talked about at the beginning, as the best worldly model available for God's engendering of his word. So Aquinas is also thinking, hey, we're not just talking about how do humans process intellectually the images that they see and make these mental representations, but there is, in thinking about that, there is a model available for thinking about God as well, which certainly an entirely empirical and entirely non-transcendental way of thinking about things is just going to totally miss out on. So whether this is just Panaccio understanding that this was a concern at that time, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with it, or whether this is something that he spends more time with in other writing, I don't know. But I at least appreciated that. And a couple of those areas where he got at those things got me thinking about that process as well, and thinking about how theology can direct our philosophical thinking, whereas there are philosophers who would reject the very idea of theology ever impact philosophy.
Yeah, I love how you put that, Chuck. I think we have to pause here for a moment and take a break. But the thing that is so controversial, and it has to be said, is that there is a qualitative difference between the religious, specifically the Christian, and the non-Christian ideas here. So Christianity presupposes, without scientific demonstration, of course, that there is a difference between the unaided human animal and the human animal that is aided by God, the divine being, the Christian God, as revealed in the scriptures. And so that's where a lot of the controversy and the fight comes down upon. To some degree, Christians are not, in fact, disagreeing with the limitations of science, with the qualifications, the perspectival aspects of the scientific method. But where we agree/disagree is in the idea that that's all there is, that the human animal remains unaided. So in the classic Western scientific sense, that's the game. You, the human animal, are limited to what you bring to the table. But in Christianity, you're absolutely not limited by what you personally, unaided, bring to the table. For if you were limited by what you brought to the table, then we're largely in agreement regarding the limitations of scientific understanding and knowledge. But that's completely beside the point. The human animal is aided, and is aided by God, and aided in certain ways that we can theologically quantify and qualify. So I think we want to go into that more and just emphasize this. This is a beautiful chapter for starting off in this particular vein. So we'll wrap things up for today. Any other last-minute thoughts here for this section?
No, nothing in particular other than this is a really good chapter. And I know last couple of weeks, we've had a couple of chapters that had some difficult depth to them, and this is yet another chapter that's got some depth to it that can be difficult to plumb. But I think the time that we're spending plumbing those depths is useful, and there's good stuff there and good things to think about, and appreciate the opportunity to read these thinkers and to think along with you about some of these concepts. It's important work to do, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to do it.